Um, so learning from past practices, mistakes, and or best practices, it's often a foundational part of any complex process. And this process of redistricting is honestly no different. That's why it's important as a commission that we learn more about how the legislative maps were drawn before in the past, and also during the 2011 redistricting process. Tonight, we're lucky to have a presentation from two individuals who personally participated in the 2011 process. First up, we'll have Keith Gaddie. He's currently a voting rights and redistricting expert and is also a professor at the University of Oklahoma. In 2011, Keith was the voting rights and data consultant counsel for the legislative majority who set our current district boundaries. We also have Kenneth Mayer, who is currently a political science professor at UW-Madison, but was also an expert witness for plaintiffs in the 2012 Wisconsin voting rights redistricting trial, and also the 2015 challenging gerrymandering in Wisconsin. Keith and Kenneth, thank you so much for joining us this evening and providing us a look back at the 2011 redistricting efforts.
So thank you. It's a privilege to talk to you and also a pleasure to give you some information with Keith, who, in addition to being a colleague who I have great respect for, is also a good friend. As you said, I've been here at the University of Wisconsin since 1989 and was an expert witness for groups challenging the map in 2011, 2012, in particular the, voting rights challenge to the districts 8 and 9 in the southern portion of the city of Milwaukee. I also was an expert witness for the plaintiffs in the 2015 Gill versus Whitford case. And Keith and I have also worked on other cases, and I'll let him introduce himself. We do have a presentation that will fire up when we're ready to get started, and we look forward to talking with you and answering questions that you have about what happened in 2011 and 2012.
Excellent. And let me echo the sentiment of my friend and colleague, Ken Mayer, who it's been my pleasure over the years to both work with, work against, and get to know Ken. And it's very nice to be working in collaboration now. I first worked in Wisconsin in 2002, being retained in litigation by the Assembly Republicans, the majority in the House and the Senate minority, and then was retained again in 2010 by counsel for the Assembly Republicans, and then subsequently for the Assembly as the majority for the 2011-12 redistricting round. Most of my work was either in data orientation, data organization, or in evaluating the voting rights performance of districts at that time, but my full scope of participation was well documented in subsequent litigation based upon my testimony as a lay witness in the Gill district level trial. I left this industry in 2014. I'm actually now a professor of architecture and journalism at University of Oklahoma. But in 2017, interceded with my colleague Bernie Groffman in drafting an amicus brief to the Supreme Court, articulating a test for detecting partisan gerrymanders and articulating the argument for why they were justiciable. And part of our presentation this evening, and the commission has been provided with this amicus brief, falls back on those three basic components of detecting a gerrymander. And Ken and I believe we agreed upon these three prongs, but also on the need of the commission to be cognizant of it, not necessarily as something to follow, but as a back test in looking at any redistricting product that arises from any institution. Ken, should we jump into it?
Sure. Molly, can we fire up the presentation? So Keith and I are going to trade off. We haven't exactly worked out exactly who's going to say what, so it's going to be a conversation between us and with you. This lays out who we are and our familiarity with the subject, and we very deliberately describe this as the problem of gerrymandering. And what we would like to walk through is some of the reasons why partisan gerrymandering is a problem and is inconsistent with key principles of democratic legitimacy, fairness, and responsiveness. Then we have a little bit of work stemming from some work that Keith has done about one of the key components of evaluating a gerrymander. And then we'll walk through some principles and then some examples from the 2012 plan of how the gerrymander, the partisan gerrymander was achieved. I can say that all of the factual statements that we are making come not from our positions as sort of observers of this, but they stem from the decision of the 3-judge panel, the district court, which concluded that the 2012 plan was an unconstitutional gerrymander that discriminated against voters and citizens based on their partisanship, which violated the First Amendment associational rights. So Molly, can we move to the next slide, and I'll kick it over to Keith.
Thank you. So the thing we have to remember is we have to remember what we're talking about. Gerrymandering is the act of crafting legislative boundaries for political advantage. So you've got a political motive and you alter the boundaries in an effort to gain political advantage. Partisan gerrymandering in particular undermines 2 major assumptions of democracy. And these are very important. And Ken and I are both American government textbook authors. And if you look in our initial chapters where we talk about democracy, we'll talk about the need for good democratic systems to have majoritarianism and responsiveness. What does that mean? That means, put simply, that who gets the majority of votes, that should translate into political power. That if you get the majority of votes, you should get the majority of seats. If you get the majority of votes in contesting a particular office, the majority vote winner should prevail. Okay, a very straightforward proposition. Then there's responsiveness, which means that if there's a change in the majority in terms of who's getting the majority of seats, that there's a majority of votes, that should in turn lead to a change in who holds the majority of seats. In addition, as a vote share increases or decreases, we should see corresponding changes in seats held. There's a caveat to be put to responsiveness, though. This is not a one-to-one proposition, which is that we don't necessarily expect 55% of the vote to lead to 55% of the seats when we use a single member district system. I will not get into the detail of that now, but there's always going to be a little bit of flux and error, and a party getting the majority of votes will often get what we call a small seat bonus. Now, the consequential impact of partisan gerrymandering is that it can defy one or both of these assumptions of democracy, and it's most dangerous when it undermines both. But what it also does in the process is it disfranchises people based upon their identity and based upon their geography. And one thing that I've contended is, in terms of identity, it's not just that if you have partisans on one side or the other, that if a party is a partisan majority and they're denied their opportunity at a representative majority, not only are they injured, but also those swing voters who may move the majority back and forth have also been disfranchised in the process. So the ability to shift and change and to have your change in preference recognized is undermined and defied by partisan gerrymandering. In addition, this gerrymander often leads to individuals who lead in certain geographies to be consistently excluded from participating in majority government, even if they're part of a popular majority. Now, one thing that our research shows is that you need institutional and process solutions to defeat gerrymandering. You can have great principles, the process solution, but if you don't have institutions in place that are going to pay heed to democracy and defend it, it's much easier to gerrymander. Let's have the next slide. Okay, so briefly, if you're looking for a fair electoral system, what you're going to see are 3 elements: symmetry, majoritarianism, and responsiveness. I briefly described these in the previous, discussing the previous slide, but this fleshes out some detail. Symmetry means that if one party gets 60% of the seats with 55% of the vote, you should expect the other party to have the same opportunity, that votes and seats will accord to either party in the majority in roughly the same proportions. You have the same kind of symmetry, the same translation of votes into seats. It will be majoritarian in that when a majority of voters express a clear preference for another party by giving it a majority, that party should get the majority control of the legislature. And finally, when voters change their preferences, responsiveness, the majority should change. Gerrymandering will violate all of these normative principles, and this not only defies the ability of the majority to get elected, it also undermines confidence in institutions. And in this era, I think we can all agree that's a critical concern. Next slide, please. Kenneth, do you want to talk about this one, or do you want me to take it?
Why don't you take it, since it's your graph?
Okay, yes. Okay, so these are a set of graphs for the seats, votes, responsiveness in Wisconsin for 2012, 14, and 16 under the new assembly map. Under a perfectly responsive map, you would, under a fair map, one thing you would expect is that at 50% of the vote, the legislature should split 50% of the seats for one party or the other, or as close as possible. So you would expect the line to pass through the 50-50 mark, the crosshair of this graphic. The second thing that you would expect to see is that there will be a small bonus of seats for one party or the other from 50 to 55%, where they kind of outperform the percentage, and then it will start to flatten out. So what you would expect to see is basically an S curve that starts down in the lower left corner of the graphic as you look at it. It proceeds on a curve up to the 50-50 line, follows a somewhat steep trajectory, and then falls off and then flattens. Okay. What's happening here is the curve that we would expect to see has shifted 5 points to the advantage of the GOP in terms of translating votes into seats, which is that according to this curve, at 45% of the vote, Republicans should get a majority of the seats. At 50%, they're going to get 60%. At 55%, they get roughly 70%. So what we're seeing going on in this map is a great deal of skew that's been introduced to the map. The map's responsive, but it's not majoritarian. Okay, it responds to changes in vote preferences, but it doesn't respond in a manner that allows both parties symmetry, the equal opportunity to elect a majority of seats based upon having the same share of the votes as a majority. Let's go to the next slide.
Actually, can we hold off on, there's one point I would like to make on the
let's go
previous slide, which is that what this shows, if you look at the blue lines, which reflect the number of seats that the Democrats would be expected to win at a given percentage of the vote, it shows that Democrats would need to win over 55% of the vote in order to obtain a majority of seats. And when you observe what happened in 2012, 2020, 2014, and 2016, in some years, the statewide vote for Democrats, as measured by votes for statewide office, either president or governor, there were years when the Democrats achieved a majority of the vote in 2012. There were years when the Democrats did not achieve a majority of the statewide votes, as in 2016. But the Democrats would have to basically get a share of the statewide vote that would be unprecedented, going back in Wisconsin political history to the 1980s or before. And to give an indicator from 2018, what the effect of this map was. In 2018, there were 5 statewide offices on the ballot: governor, secretary of state, attorney general, treasurer, and U.S. senator. Democratic candidates won all 5 of these races with a share of the votes that ranged between just a little bit over 50% up to about 57% for the Senate candidate. And the number of seats that Democratic candidates controlled in the Assembly basically did not change at all. I think there was a 1 seat change. And this reflects one of the points that was made in the litigation in 2015 about how durable the gerrymander enacted in 2012 was, that it essentially protects the Republican majority in the Senate or in the Assembly under any plausible statewide vote that Democratic candidates might achieve, or what the preferences would be of voters. And this is why the Wisconsin gerrymander in 2012 is regarded as one of the most extreme in American history. So we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, the only other comparable to this would have been the Georgia gerrymander in 2001, which oddly enough was thrown out by a federal court and was sustained, but it was on one person a basis rather than partisan gerrymandering basis. This is one of the most effective maps I've ever seen in terms of locking in an impediment to a majority emerging.
So I can talk a little bit about this and what happened in 2012. There are 2 complementary strategies that are used to gerrymander, and they both stem from the fact that in a single member district, in Wisconsin, where it's the first past the post, so the candidate who receives the most votes wins the district. It doesn't matter if you win the seat by 1 vote or if you win the seat by all of the votes, you still get the seat. And so that provides opportunities to introduce a bias into how those votes are aggregated into seats. There are 2 ways that this is done. The first is called packing, when the party doing the gerrymandering takes voters from the other party and packs them into a small number of districts where they have overwhelming majority. So often the packing will be to the extent that the districts will be uncontested. So in a district where Democrats are packed, the Republicans frequently will not even run a candidate because there's no point. And that concentrates disfavored voters into a small number of districts. The complement of this is cracking, where you take constituencies or geographies where the disfavored party, in this case, the Democrats, actually would comprise a majority, but you split them up so that instead of having a district where Democrats constitute, say, hypothetically or just notionally, 60% of the voters, you split those into 2 districts where the Democrats comprise 30% of each. And so that allows the gerrymandering party to more efficiently translate votes into seats. And the record of the Whitford trial, we're leaving aside the voting rights issues because that presents a different set of concerns. This happened all over the state. And in the next 3 slides, we have some examples, 2 from smaller cities or smaller municipalities, and then we have a set of examples from Milwaukee County and the districts around Milwaukee County that show pretty clearly how this was done. So can we go to the next slide? This is in the 6th congressional district. We're focusing on the Assembly because that's where there are the most opportunities to do this. The shadings in this map reflect an estimate of the underlying partisanship of an area based on a combination of votes over a series of years for statewide offices. Areas that are shaded in red are areas that are Republican, and the darker the color, the more heavily Republican the area is. Areas that are shaded in blue, conversely, are Democratic areas. And again, the intensity or the strength of the Democratic support is reflected in the intensity of the shading. These two cities are the cities of Manitowoc and Two Rivers, which have typically been kept together. They constitute what would generally be regarded as a community of interest, voters or a region that has similar economic interests. It is a Democratic area, as many of the cities in Wisconsin are. And you can see that the cities of Manitowoc and Two Rivers are split right down the middle between two assembly districts. Manitowoc has a population, 2010 census population of about 34,000, and it's marginally Democratic. It's about 52%. It was certainly possible to place this entire both of these cities into a single district, because the ideal population of an assembly district was a little over 57,000 in after the 2010 census. So this is just a classic example of cracking, in which in this case, a Democratic area consisting of two cities and some of the areas in between were split up into two districts and merged with larger populations of Republican voters to deliver two safe Republican districts instead of a likely Democratic district, or certainly a competitive district. Keith, do you have any observations about this?
Well, I'd say, Ken, let's keep going and kind of loop around at the end. But the thing to remember is that any districting choice is, in a sense of here's the thing I would remember. Community of interest matter, but community of interest is a very difficult concept to deal with sometimes, because, as our colleague Bruce Kane at Berkeley says, community interest is in the eye of the beholder, that almost anything can be defined as a community of interest. So one thing you may think about is, as you go about your business, is finding ways for communities of interest to come forward and identify themselves and present themselves and make themselves known. And history and ritual and habit will help define communities of interest. But oftentimes people attempt to muddy the waters of community of interest by introducing too many different conceptualizations of it just to justify crafting the district they want. But geographic and economic interests are powerful communities of interest. Indeed, there are special protections for racial, ethnic, and First Nation groups, which can be considered communities of interest, but are much more under voting rights law and have additional protections and consideration by you in this process. So take care in engaging community of interest to make sure that they are powerful and well-defined concepts of the sort that Professor Mayer has introduced already.
So good points. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a portion of Milwaukee County on the right, with the Ozaukee County to the north, Washington County to the northwest, and Waukesha County to the west. It shows, as is common in understanding Wisconsin's political geography, that Milwaukee is the largest and one of the most democratic regions of the state, mostly in the city of Milwaukee, but not entirely, surrounded by the collar counties, Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington, which are three of the, if not the three, most Republican areas in the state. Again, blue, Democratic, red, Republican. And you can see throughout this map, the point to make in this map is not just what happened within the city of Milwaukee, because a number of these districts, particularly in the north central and northwest part of the city, are majority minority African American districts that are essentially required under the Voting Rights Act. But outside of that, if you look at the districts that surround Milwaukee County and Ozaukee, Washington, and Waukesha, you see all of the districts have little fingers and little jogs that reach into Milwaukee County and pick up Democratic areas of the county, again submerging these Democratic areas of Milwaukee County into much larger populations of Republican voters, taking what would easily be a Democratic district and turning it into a number of Republican districts. So just for example, if you look at the 23rd district, which extends just below where it says Ozaukee County on the Lake Michigan shoreline, and that little finger comes down into Milwaukee County through the northern lakeshore suburbs. That area in District 23 in Milwaukee County is a strongly Democratic area that contains about 25,000 people. So that's about a little less than half the population of an assembly district. But those voters are submerged into or merged into a district that has even more strongly Republican voters in the rest of the 23rd district, which render it a safe Republican district. Similarly, in the 24th, you see the 24th is almost entirely in, actually, the 24th district contains pieces of Milwaukee, Ozaukee, Washington, and Waukesha County. But the area in the 24th district in Milwaukee County is a 60% Democratic area, but it was submerged into an area of heavily Republican voters that was essentially twice as large. And we can see the same thing in the 22nd district, which again extends from Milwaukee County into Waukesha County and up into Washington County. That little area, that vertical strip in Milwaukee County, again, is an overwhelmingly Democratic area. But there were only about 7,000 voters or 7,000 people in that area. So those Democratic voters are submerged into a district with a much larger population of Republican voters. And so they are cracked. You see the same thing in the 13th, 14th, and 15th district, which extend horizontally from Waukesha County into Milwaukee County, taking large Republican areas and extending into Milwaukee County to pick up Democratic areas. They're essentially cracking those Democratic voters. One thing we can say, if you look at the areas of Milwaukee County that are contained in the 13th, 14th, and 15th district, there's over 100,000 people in those areas. So you could create not just one assembly district, but almost two, probably 1 2/3 of an assembly district. So ultimately, you look in this area alone, probably cost the Democrats at least 3 districts and perhaps more. I've got one more slide, one more example of showing examples of cracking. So can we go to the next slide?
Before we go back to that one real quick?
Sure.
There's the thing, everything that Ken has just described is also happening in the Senate for the very same reason. Because Wisconsin uses a pod mechanism of crafting the assembly, which is a Senate district with 3 assembly districts directly underneath. Districts 13, 14, and 15, which are exhibiting these effects in the assembly, have the same impact on the Senate seat that sits above that district, okay, above these 3 districts. And so it's very important to remember that even though the Senate seats will look more reasonable, more well-rounded, they're often going to have the same effects at work underneath because of the structure of the pod. I just wanted to make sure we got that on the table real quick.
Right. So yeah, in Wisconsin, that each Senate district is made up of 3 assembly districts. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th assembly districts together make the the 5th Senate district and the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th Assembly district make the, I always have to do this in my head, you divide the highest number by 3, so that's the 8th Assembly district. So this, again, this structure by itself cost the Democrats at least 1 Senate district, possibly 2, which makes a difference in part because the Senate, the distribution of Senate majorities generally will be a little bit closer than the distribution of partisan majorities in the Assembly. So that is important to keep in mind. So let's go to the next slide. This is also in the 6th district, and this is the city of Sheboygan, which is again split between 2 districts. The city of Sheboygan has a total population of a little over 49,000 people, so it's almost big enough to form a complete assembly district under traditional redistricting principles, which is supposed to show respect for local political subdivisions and municipal boundaries. It was not necessary to split the city, and by splitting the city, it took what would have been, so you have the city of Sheboygan, which is a fairly strongly Democratic area. You would have had to add probably another 8,000 voters in the surrounding area, which would have created a district of 57,000. It would have almost certainly have been a Democratic district. By splitting that into 2 areas, one with 32,000 in the south, another with about 17,000 in the north, it turned 1 Democratic district into 2 Republican districts. And this happened all over the state. Some of the examples are a little bit more difficult to show graphically because the districts have a wider geographic spread, but there are still examples of packing and cracking. One of the well, we'll just focus on these examples. We can talk about some others if you have questions about it. And we have one more slide talking about principles to keep in mind, and I'll leave this to Keith.
All righty. You're going to be introduced to a lot of different redistricting principles in this process. The one thing that is necessary is the equalization of population, but you'll hear about different measures of compactness, which have to do with the regularity of shape of the district. County splits, city splits, township splits. We've introduced communities of interest, competitiveness, responsiveness. So many different criterion can be brought to the table, but they're also in competition, which is, for example, it may be that the most responsive map is not the most compact map, or it may be that the map that offers the most compactness ends up splitting cities or townships or villages. It may be the case that in attempting to preserve communities of interest, you defy a variety of other principles. And the other thing is you run into some natural influences of geography, which is that you have, for example, you have a concentration of African-American and Hispanic voters in Milwaukee, and you have Voting Rights Act Section 2 obligations to ensure equal opportunity to elect districts in those communities in order to
It looks like Keith, we had a little technical snag there until he comes
end up
back.
hacking in Democratic voters and create a Republican skew in the
Keith,
map.
you kind of froze for about 30 seconds.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'll tell you what I'm going to do is, am I good now?
Yeah.
Okay. What I was saying, I was basically going into voting rights obligations, and you need to craft equal opportunity to elect districts in Milwaukee County. And in crafting those districts, you're going to be packing in Democratic voters. It's as simple as that. The question is, how can you satisfy the Voting Rights Act requirements without needlessly packing in Democratic voters? One thing we know from research is that Democratic voters often, white Democratic voters close in to majority minority communities are often also Democrats, especially in the Midwest and in the Northeast and on the West Coast. So in crafting majority minority districts, you're necessarily going to introduce some skew in the map that will naturally tend towards a Republican advantage. But that doesn't preclude the map from being responsive and otherwise symmetric. Okay, it's worth noting those things. It's possible to draw a responsive, symmetric map and also satisfy the Voting Rights Act. But this is the main thing you have to remember is you've got, I'd say principles are important, but the key, as we've noted at the bottom of the slide, is to identify the key values that you wish to pursue and then to be transparent, okay? A public process. Sunshine is always the best antiseptic, right? A process performed in public with public access, eyeballs on the process. We saw this when North Carolina recrafted their maps after they were thrown out a couple of years ago. A process that was literally on camera was able to preclude legislators from engaging in additional gerrymandering activity in the process of creating a map to satisfy the Supreme Court. So transparency, visibility, accessibility are every bit as important as any particular redistricting principle you might pick, like compactness, okay? You're not going to get a perfect map, get a good map. Don't let the pursuit of perfection become the enemy of what is good enough to allow for responsiveness and symmetry. But also follow your judgment. Follow your judgment. Don't be overwhelmed with the math. The math behind this doesn't have to be that complex and that involved. Is a majority of votes leading to a majority of seats? Will the analysis show that if the majority shifts, the seats should shift, right? If you ensure that you're simply relying on math that's accessible and understandable, and you combine that with judgment, you can craft fair maps. And then finally, there's the biggest problem, which is you have a gerrymander. It should be undone. I'm of the opinion the court should have undone it. Undoing the map and reversing it can result in a gerrymander that goes in the opposite direction just as easily. A fair map can reverse a gerrymander, okay? But a map that reverses a gerrymander may not be fair. So one thing, some of the things you have to think about is in crafting the map, what do you do with your party data? Do you even access it, or do you keep it turned off and draw a map based upon neutral principles and then turn on the party data, go back and see, is it responsive and is it symmetrical? And if it's not, how do you adjust it while still adhering to your core values and principles? These are the things to be thinking about, is at what point does information about things like partisanship become relevant to ensuring fairness? That's a decision you all have to make. None of us can tell you, but the one thing I can say is that a good map won't start with party, but a good map will make sure that it assesses party at the end of the day, because all politics and all organizational principles in modern politics come back to party. People will say it's about rural and urban, and it's about upstate and downstate, and it's Milwaukee and Madison versus the rest of the state. That's not how the legislature is organized. It's organized by party. Power is allocated by party. And it's going to have to come back to party. So make sure it's fair and responsive for party.
And maybe just close with one thought. I imagine that you will be receiving lots of recommendations, if not pressure. It's a common argument. Just let computers do it. Let's set a rule. You have a computer, you plug it in, it generates a map, and we're done. Well, the problem with that, well, there are two problems with that. As Keith said, even a neutral rule can produce a very biased outcome, and reliance on an algorithm to produce a map could very well produce a map that is deeply flawed. The second problem with automated map methods is that it depends on who writes the program, or who defines the program. It turns out, and that there is an ongoing argument or a sort of debate, we'll call it, within the academic community about the ability of automated processes to draw effective maps. And it is complicated by the fact that the number of possible maps in a state like Wisconsin, even if you assume a building block like wards, there are about 4,700 wards in the state. The number of possible combinations that Wisconsin can be districted into 99 districts, that number is larger than the number of hydrogen atoms in the universe. And there is no feasible way of generating all of those maps to even determine where a map you're drawing fits into that space. So one of the possible solutions, or one of the ways of dealing with that, is to, first of all, be skeptical or think critically about recommendations to rely on algorithmic maps, because there are a lot of programs and methods that exist that purport to do this in a fair way. But one of the things we're looking at here, a few months ago, we got a grant here, I and some colleagues in computer science, geography, and political science, to investigate redistricting from a multidisciplinary perspective. And one of the things that we are looking at is how you can use computer methods or algorithmic methods to evaluate a given map. So the idea is that you would draw a map based on judgment and what sort of looks like it meets the criteria for a map that you would regard as fair, responsive, neutral, symmetric. And then you use computers to make minor changes in the map, to perturb the map. And you do this trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of times. And you look at the distribution of all the maps that this process generates. And so you can see where your map exists in a geographic space against a huge number of alternatives. And that you can use that to determine how your map fits within the distribution of all possible maps starting from that point. So there are a variety of things that can be done, but in my view, and Keith shares this, is that this is not a process where you can push a button, tell a computer to go and use whatever Markov chain Monte Carlo models and all the different ways you can describe the map, come up with a map, and then be satisfied that you've done your job and everybody can go home. That's not how this is going to work.